Long ago in old Paris, near a great cathedral, there lived a lace maker named Griselle. As a young woman, she had been very beautiful, and she had been courted by many in the city. She chose a poor but laughing soldier with a red plume in his hat. His name was Beau. Alas, they were married but for a week, when Beau and all his regiment were marched off to war. Griselle never saw him or heard from him again. The years passed, and she was neither wife nor widow, but she did not despair. It was not in her nature to do so. Instead, she devoted herself to the little creatures that lived in the shadow of the cathedral, the birds and the cats in the neighborhood. Every day she would walk past the cathedral and across the bridge to market, and there she would buy a loaf of bread, and she would fill her pitcher with fresh milk and take them home. Half the bread and half the milk she kept for herself, and the other she shared, crumbling the bread into little bits for the birds and pouring the milk into saucers which she placed under the bushes throughout the neighborhood. The birds and the cats came to love her and to count on her and to consider her their mother, and she considered them very fine company. The years went by, and she made miracles of lace, but every day she walked across the bridge to the market, in rain or shine, wind or calm. And she came home and she shared half of her meager fare. At last, the stone angels carved on the face of the cathedral took notice of her, watching her walk across that bridge, knowing she would come home and give away half of what she purchased. They spoke in the sound of cooing doves. There she goes. She never forgets. She never will. And their words came down to the gargoyles who were carved at the edges and ledges of the cathedral, spitting out water whenever it rained. Now, if there is anything that gargoyles hate, it is the smell and look of a good woman. And they hate hearing about one even more than they hate hearing of a good man. And so they began to grumble to one another in the sound that the townspeople thought was the rumbling of cartwheels. That night, when Paris slept, one of the gargoyles went to speak to the angels and said, "It is easy to be good when it comes to feeding birds and cats. We mean to give your good Griselle a test, an ugly and unlovable child. Many a good mother has come to ill with such." The angels shook their heads, and it sounded like the waving of red plumes in the air. They said, "She is too old to have a child. Alas, her husband is many years gone. She cannot have a child. We will supply the child, but you must promise not to help in any way." And the angels agreed. Now, the gargoyles realize that once an angel has begun making a bargain, they must follow through. And so the gargoyle said, "And if we are right, and Griselle is not good, one of you must come down and squat on the edges and the ledges, cursing God's name and spitting out water for 100 years. And the angels, they shuddered at this. And then, thinking of the goodness of Griselle, they said, "We agree, but if we are right, then one of you must come and stand with us back straight, singing hosannas to heaven for 100 years. And the gargoyles shuddered. Down below, Griselle slept in her bed, dreaming of her young husband. It was a dream that was both happy and sad, and she wept and laughed in her sleep, but she did not wake up. And then something was flung from the top of the cathedral, and it landed with a thud just outside her door. It scattered the birds. But Griselle would have slept on, dreaming of her young husband, if the creature outside the door had not begun to cry. And the cry broke the peace of the Paris night, and it sounded like something between a sob and a laugh. Griselle got up and pulled her dressing gown about her, went to the door and opened it, and looked down and saw the ugliest child she had ever seen. He had corn-colored hair and 2 ears that stuck up like horns. His eyes were crossed. His nose and his chin nearly met in the middle, and his teeth were black. At first she thought he might be an imp of Satan, but then he cried again, part sob, part laughter, and she knew that the devil cannot weep. And so she opened her door wider and gestured for him to come inside. But the ugly child did not move. It seemed as though he was rooted to the spot, and then he lifted up his arms and said, "Mama!" His voice was like cracked leather. She bent down and she picked him up, and her nose wrinkled a little, for he was as ripe as a bowl of milk left too long in the sun. When they saw her lift the child, the angels began to sing a benison, and the gargoyle said, "Hush, tush, you may not help." And just at that moment, the little boy reached up and grabbed a hank of her hair and pulled, and Griselle shrieked. And when she did that, the gargoyles began to chortle, and the angel said, "Hush, tush, you may not help." And Griselle tilted her head as though she heard them, and then she pulled the child hard against her breast and went inside. And so, for all of the winter and the spring and the hot Paris summer, Griselle looked after the child. She made him clothes from her own clothes, a linen shirt from her petticoat, and blue trousers from her cloak, and a little vest with pearl buttons from her wedding dress. His clothes were handsome, but his face was not. Still, she gave him the name Beau, hoping that he would grow into it. He was full of mischief. He went into the barrel maker's store and rolled the barrels about. He went into the cheesemaker shop and he threw about the cheese. And she would say, "Do to others as you would be done by." Then he might pull the tails of the cats or steal the eggs of the birds, and she would say, "A gentle hand is best." And when he stole coins from the poor box in the cathedral, she made him put it back double, for there are those who are not as fortunate as we. And Griselle grew to love the child, though the barrel maker and the cheese maker and the cats and the birds and all the neighbors called him Gargoyle. She loved him. Now, as the fall began to move toward winter, the gargoyles began to worry. They hated losing a wager, especially a Christmas wager, and Christmas was coming up. And so they prayed to their own dark gods for extra assistance. You will recall that the angels promised not to help, but being bred in duplicity, the gargoyles made no such promise. And so 2 days before Christmas, in the dark of the night, there came walking down the street a young soldier, and in his hat was a red plume, though it was a bit bedraggled. And if his skin was the color of stone, the darkness hid it. And if he had ears like horns, they were hidden by his hat. And if his smile went only to the teeth and not the eyes, it might be a trick of the light. He stepped before Griselle's door and he knocked upon it. She was surprised. She had few visitors in the evening and none at night, but she opened the door and when she saw the young soldier, she thought that she was dreaming. Then he took her hand. "I am home, wife." And she knew it was real. She brought him in and she hurried to get him some wine and some cake. She stopped at the glass and seeing how old she had gotten, her tears came quickly, for he was still so young and handsome. If she wondered about it, she thought that travel had suited him very well. When she came back to the table, she saw that he stood over the bed where little Beau was sleeping. He said, "This is my bed. Move him." And she said nothing, but bent down and lifted the child wrapped in a blanket and set him gently down beside the hearth where he slept the whole night. And in the morning, when she served breakfast to the soldier and some to little Beau, the man looked across the table and said, "Do not give my food away. Give it to me." Griselle almost said something, but she took the food from Beau's plate and placed it on her husband's. He ate with relish, and so he did not see how she took the food from her plate and placed it on her son's plate. But during that day, the boy was as mischievous as ever, rolling the barrels, throwing the cheese, chasing the birds and the cats, and at last pulling the plume out of the soldier's hat and pulling each barb off the plume, and that was strange, for each one dripped blood. When he saw that, the man stood up and he grabbed the child and he threw him over his waist there on his knees, and he reached his hand up to beat him, and Griselle, looking horrified, ran forward and she took the blow. Then she picked up the boy and she said to him, "You are not my husband. He was a gentleman, though he went to war. You may have a plume in your hat, but there is no flame in your heart." Yes, the boy is full of mischief, but you see, he is the gentler soul. So leave me now with my son. And though she hated to do it, and it was Christmas Eve, she pushed the soldier out the door and comforted little Beau. And that night, when midnight mass rolled round, the child placed his hand in hers, and the two walked to the great cathedral. And as they reached the door, the stone angels looking down said, "Such a good woman, such an ugly child." And Griselle said, "Hush, tush. If hate could transform a handsome man, surely love can change an ugly child. Can't you see that Beau has grown into his name?" And then she leaned down and said, "Pay them no mind. They are made of stone after all." Years later, old Griselle died in her sleep and went straight to heaven. And that same night, her ugly son disappeared. But if you look closely at the angels on the cathedral, you will see that they are not all handsome. There is one with crossed eyes, and his teeth are black. But he is the only one with an absolutely angelic smile. Good Griselle by Jane Yolen.